Under Pete Carroll and John Schneider, the Seahawks have never picked a cornerback earlier than the third round. Might that change now that they have the number 5 pick in the 2023 NFL Draft? We'll be breaking it all down on our Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined for Blue Friday by my co-host, Nick Lee. And a special thanks, as always, to all the 12s out there for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We're getting close to the draft now. Inside 2 weeks until the real deal gets here, we're going to be tackling your mailbag questions in our weekly mailbag, and we'll be taking a look at Seattle's free agent class, playing a little bit of what's the odds, looking at some projections for this upcoming season for the newest members of the Seahawks. Now for your lead story here on our Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Under Pete Carroll and John Schneider, the Seahawks have never picked a corner earlier than the third round. Back in 2017, Shaquille Griffin was selected in the third round. That's the highest pick that they have invested in that position. And obviously, the organization's had a lot of success developing day 3 picks. Tariq Woolen last year, Richard Sherman back in the day, Jeremy Lane as well. To varying degrees, they've had a lot of success with late-round corners. So the argument can be made, why would you change your strategy or your philosophy and pick a corner earlier than that? But Nick, with the number 5 overall pick, this might be the deepest, most talented cornerback group that I've covered in my 10 plus years covering the draft. And there just happens to be a couple of shutdown corners at the top of this class that are among the blue chip players. And I think it at least creates some discussion for the Seahawks, depending how the board unfolds in the first 4 picks, for them to potentially select one there.
Yeah, and I think the board needs to break a certain way for this to really become any sort of possibility. I can already feel Seahawks Twitter and some YouTube comments kind of breaking down at the thought of this happening. But you mentioned that this is a pretty deep class, and my side of things is the Seahawks have had such success developing day 2, day 3 corners that and why would they use such a unique position that they're in the top 5 in the draft, that which they hardly ever, if ever, will have again. Hopefully not. Why would you then use that? There's 2 ways of thinking. First, last year, I think we can all agree in the last 7, 8, 9 years was the most chalk draft the Seahawks have had, where it's best player available. They were taking a lot of guys that people had mocked to them, which was really weird. And it turned out really well. So, there's some of that too, where if you go chalk in the draft, there's something to that. For me, I found a really interesting article I wanted to share. I wanted to give a shout out to Bruin Sports Analytics. They sent out an article in December 2021 that basically broke down, which positions are most valuable to select in the first round, which are the safer ones, and which are a bit more risky. And their analysis was based on the research that quarterbacks, offensive linemen, and defensive tackles were the most valuable positions to draft in the first round. So for me, Jalen Carter, I understand there's a lot of risk, and I've even been off the train a little bit with him. But as far as getting positional value and possible, all-pro talent, and the drop-off, I think we can all agree as well, the drop-off in interior defensive line talent is immense after Jalen Carter. And so if you want that, Jalen Carter's the guy. On the other hand, tight ends, cornerbacks, and safeties make up the least valuable positions in the first round, meaning that you can get solid players at those positions in rounds 2, 3, 4, and beyond, especially with the Seahawks' ability to do that. Where I'm not saying that there's not elite corners that can be found. You can look at Sauce Gardner, just look last year. That can be had. My position is, I wonder if you're in such a unique position at 5, with your past history of being able to develop corners on days 2 and 3, or rounds 2 and 3 and beyond. I'm wondering if that is the best use of a 5th pick. But if you truly feel like he is that, if Devon Witherspoon is that kind of generational talent, then I guess you got to go for it. But I'm kind of pumping the brakes a little bit on my end, just with the positional value and Jalen Carter or a quarterback if he falls, those are more valuable in the first round to find. But an argument can be made. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not going to shut it down, but I'm a little with trepidation. I'm looking into this.
Yeah, and I think anybody that has covered this team, watched this team closely, knows defensive tackle is a far bigger need than what corner is right now. And Mike Jackson played well at the other cornerback spot across from Tariq Woolen last year. I don't think that he's gotten enough love for what he did in his first season as a starter. You still got Trey Brown on the roster. So I understand that, and you make some very good points, especially with the depth in this class. You can get some really good corner. At the same, look at rate for top 5 corners dating back to 2010, John Schneider's first year. There have been 5 corners selected in the first 5 picks. The only bust, and I don't necessarily want to use that label yet on him, he just got traded, Jeff Okudah going to the Falcons. Maybe a change of scenery will help him find his way. He played much better last year, most of the season for the Lions. Number 3 overall pick out of Ohio State a few years back. But you look at the rest of the list. Patrick Peterson with Arizona, 3-time first-team All-Pro, a bunch of Pro Bowl selections. Jalen Ramsey, Sauce Gardner last year. I mean, corners that are picked in the top 5 generally have ended up being really good players. And the Seahawks have not had the opportunity to draft one of those type of guys because they haven't had a pick this high in the draft. And like you said, I think it really boils down to how the draft board plays out. And if Jalen Carter is still on Seattle's draft board and he's there at number 5, that's the player that you pick. But what we don't know is how their meeting with him went this week. We don't know where things stand as far as whether he's on their board or not, because they have been paying much more attention to character ever since the Malik McDowell situation in 2017. They have been drafting players that are very high character from round 1 all the way to round 7, a lot of team captains, guys like that. So he might not be on their board. We don't know at this point. Will Anderson's probably going to be gone the first 4 picks. If the quarterback they want is not there at number 5 and you don't have Anderson and Carter's off your board, that creates a little bit of a conundrum, and it's going to be difficult to trade down, especially if you have a run on quarterbacks early and a team doesn't want to move up for somebody like, say, Will Levis. So that would be the worst case scenario. And in that instance, you might not be able to get much value trading down. And if you're wanting to draft a legitimate top 5 caliber player, for me personally, it's Devon Witherspoon. And I know Christian Gonzalez from Oregon is also a player that is getting plenty of buzz, and for good reason. They're both really good players that I think deserve to be top 10 selections. But watching the film, Devon Witherspoon, in my opinion, is the much more polished player. And even when you look at the raw statistics last year, he was first in college football in pass breakups, first in passer rating, 3rd in completion rate. He was tied for first, giving up no touchdowns. Christian Gonzalez gave up 3 touchdowns last year. He had 6 pass breakups, which is a good number, but there were 72 players in the country that had more. Completion rate was 207th, and passer rating was 97th. Again, he's a good player. There's a lot to like about the film. But just for me personally, Devon Witherspoon is the one that is the top 5 talent of this group. And it's a player that checks off all the boxes, away from the fact that he's not a big corner with long arms. He checks off every single other box. He's a physical hitter that decapitates dudes in open field. He is sticky in man coverage and zone coverage. He gets his hands on the football a lot. And when he does get interceptions, Northwestern figured this out last year into the season. He basically turns into a running back when he has the football, and he's really hard to get to the ground. So there's a lot to like about him. And I think Gonzalez is a player that makes a lot of sense, that fits more of Seattle's size projection at 6'2". He's a bigger corner with longer arms. Both of them are really good athletes. And so I think they're both top 10 players. And if you end up in a position where the board doesn't fall the right way, then you got to get the best player available. And I'm sorry, Mike Jackson and Trey Brown, but Devon Witherspoon is a much better player than either one of those guys with higher ceilings. So that would be the case, I think, where you draft a corner. And I don't think that it's completely out of the equation that could happen, because the first four picks, we could see some craziness happen. And if those first 4 picks don't go Seattle's way, then they could get in a situation where Devon Witherspoon is the best player, or maybe they think Christian Gonzalez is the best one. But those corners would stand out as the elite talents that are still on the board at that selection, maybe Tyree Wilson as well. And so Seattle would have to make a choice then. So I would not completely rule it out, but like you said, there's some really good points here. And I think we can agree that if Jalen Carter's on the board, that is still probably the guy that you should be picking because of the positional need and just the pure talent that he has.
Yeah, and just furthering this, the research article I dove into, which was very fascinating. Whoever wrote that did a great job. On the other hand, the boom or bust potential is a lot narrower. There are a lot less boom and bust with cornerbacks in the first round than, say, quarterbacks or tackles or edge rushers. So if you want to go for perhaps a safer pick with your arguments, the top 5 corners have hit really well, plus this data that says that corners are among the safer positions to draft in the first round, then you can make that argument too. But defensive tackles also have a pretty high hit rate when drafted that high. I think I read somewhere, I know it's not that simple, but as far as cornerbacks being taken in the first round the last 4 years, 4 of them have become Pro Bowlers, and defensive linemen that have been drafted in the first round the last 5 years, 9 have been Pro Bowlers. So I know there's a little bit difference in like the amount of each player, but so it's a great argument. I think it's going to be a lot of fun on draft day in just less than 2 weeks, and these guys got to be ready to think on the fly, because if you got Jalen Carter and Will Anderson and your top 2 quarterbacks off the board 1 through 4, you gotta earn your money there.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens. And I would just tell 12s out there that corner is probably on the low part of the totem pole as far as what they want to do there. But there is going to be consideration depending how that board plays out, because you do have a couple of elite talents at the top of this draft class. And there's not a lot of blue chippers in this class. There's a lot of really good players, but not a lot of blue chippers. There are 2 corners that you can make arguments belong in that group. And so Seattle would be wise to consider either one of them at that selection. When we come back, we're going to be answering your questions, our weekly mailbag segment here on our Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. If you listen to our podcast regularly, you know how much I love the mobile game Ultimate Football GM. And if you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL general manager and managing your own franchise, your dream can come true. This game is definitely for you. Manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the season, and lead your team to glory. You're responsible for everything from hiring the right coaches and coordinators to trading players, making draft picks like Schneider is going to be doing here in less than 2 weeks, navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft, and all the ups and downs of a season. All of this in a challenging and realistic game world. If you want to give John Schneider a run for his money running your own team, and certainly do a better job than I've done with the Honolulu Sharks, this is the way to go. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. Play on the go as you want and when you want to. It's a blast, and our listeners should join in the fun in their own league. Locked On Seahawks listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when they use the promo code Locked On. That's in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps, so make sure to check it out today. Download the game at ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. You're listening to the Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined on today's show by my co-host, Nick Lee. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Whether you're listening in Utah, Texas, or across the country in Rhode Island, we greatly appreciate you making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. And for our everydayers out there that listen to the show 5 days a week, we're going to be back with our mock draft madness on Monday, looking at a handful of the latest expert drafts and taking a look extensively at guard prospects. To prepare for that show, make sure to check out our NFL Draft newsletter here at Locked On. Luke Inman's doing a fantastic job putting that together. You can check out that free resource at lockedonpodcast.com/newsletters to sign up for your first free NFL Draft newsletter. All right, Nick, it's time for mailbag questions here on Friday. Tons of questions from our listeners. Let's get to our first one from John Montalvo, and this one's for Nick. What was Seattle's biggest miss in free agency this year, in your opinion?
Well, now that we've seen the whole class as a whole, I'm not quite as picky as I was before when I started seeing some names fly around that weren't going to Seattle. But if I had to pick one, maybe two, I know the price point might cause some hand-wringing. Tremaine Edmonds, I think, is a fantastic linebacker. And I think that he's young enough. He's younger than Jordan Brooks, as we've said on the show. He's been very, very productive. And I know that he was pretty expensive, rightfully so. A young linebacker who's talented, been productive in this league. I think that would have been really, really awesome to pair him with Jordan Brooks in the future. Him or selfishly Jamal Williams. I just think he's a ball of hilarity. I just think he's just an awesome personality. I know he might have been more expensive than what the Seahawks might have been looking for a paired running back with Ken Walker. But those are the two I'd look at. One for scheme and skill with Tremaine Edmonds and filling in the holes at linebacker, and one just for selfish reasons. Jamal Williams is just too much fun.
Second question here from Seahawks FWD tweets: do you think the Seahawks will draft a running back this year to replace Rashad Penny? And if so, who would be your choice? So they're going to have to draft at least one running back. We've been talking about this. I mean, you have 3 on the roster right now. DJ Dallas is a free agent after this year. Darwin Thompson hasn't played an NFL game for 2 years. So they need to add talent behind Ken Walker III there. We've seen you can never have too many running backs with the attrition at that position. As far as replacing Rashad Penny, though, I know that the injuries were a major problem in his 5 seasons, and he was never able to reach his potential because of that. But we saw what he could do when he was healthy. Trying to find 235-pound running backs that run in the 4.4s, you're going to have a hard time finding players like that. They don't grow on trees. Bijan Robinson is about that size, not quite that fast. So he would be the player that would make the most sense. If he somehow fell into the second round, maybe Seattle decides to go that route and pair him with Ken Walker III. But there aren't really a lot of backs in this class that have that size and that type of explosiveness. Maybe the closest thing you can get on day 3 is McBride from UAB, who is a big-bodied running back, not quite as big, 215, but he's a guy that's a battering ram and also has the ability to hit some home runs, did that for UAB. There's just not a lot of backs in this class that are on the 225-plus pound side, though. There's a lot of 195, 200-pound running backs. So if you're looking for a carbon copy of Rashad Penny, away from maybe Bijan Robinson, he still doesn't have that 4.4 speed, you're just going to have a hard time finding a guy with those tools and that size because, again, they don't grow on trees. Third question here, going for Nick. This one's from Mark tweets: can you see a scenario where the Seahawks trade back a few spots from 5 and take Peter Skoronski at guard? At what pick does he become a viable option in your opinion?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned trade back because I don't think he's an option at 5.
Yeah.
I don't think that is responsible. Now, I do think he's a fantastic player, and you draft him. He's probably your second best offensive lineman of your entire roster, perhaps, maybe even best. It depends on how that breaks out. But, in a scenario like that, you definitely want to trade back, I'd say 9-10, and recoup a pick there, late first round, early second round. I would definitely prefer to get in the double digits before you think about taking Skoronski. If he follows a 20 somehow, great. I think that would be a coup. I don't think that's probably going to happen. I think that he's too sought after, and I do like his game and him at guard with the Seahawks and what they want to do with running the football. I think would be a fantastic fit. But yeah, I do want probably 10. And even then, that might be too rich. But definitely trading back, recouping some picks, and if you feel good about other spots where you have some picks, at 10 was probably where I'd start looking at him.
Yeah, you got to make sure if he's going to be playing guard in terms of value, a top 10 pick for a guard is probably not the way that you
even then, that gave me a pit in my stomach. So, I mean, yeah, probably beyond 10, but he won't last till 20 probably.
No, he's not going to be on the board till then. Gabe King tweets, with all the talk of cornerbacks going to Seattle early, I feel like I'm one of the few that still believe in Trey Brown as an outside corner. Do either of you believe that Trey Brown could be the corner opposite Tariq Woolen? Well, of course I do, if he could play like he did his rookie year before his injury. The problem that he's going to be battling now is that when he did play last year, he didn't look quite as good, and Mike Jackson had a very solid season. So this is a little bit different situation than if you're weighing whether or not to take Devon Witherspoon. If you view him as a pure shutdown cornerback that you can get at number 5 overall, then you strongly consider doing that. But in this case, a guy that is now going to be going into the 3rd year on his contract, he's only got 1 other year left in his rookie deal. That does create a little bit of an obstacle there when you have Mike Jackson firmly in front of you on the depth chart. So I think he's got the talent to do it. I just wonder if the situation is going to be there for him to be able to play, because Mike Jackson is going to be hanging on to that starting job. And if they somehow draft a corner early, that's going to put him further behind the 8 ball, at least at outside corner. Maybe then, Nick, might agree with me on this, but maybe then slot corner might be a possibility for him to compete there if he wants to battle for playing time.
Yeah, I'm a believer still in Trey Brown. I know there's some injury concerns there, but I did like his game in his rookie year. I was a big proponent of him when they drafted him, and as long as he can, prove hopefully another offseason, healthy, getting stronger instead of worrying about rehabbing, or at least he's past that point, hopefully. And I think that there's still a place for Trey Brown in the 2023 Seahawks.
Yeah, we'll find out where things are going there, depending on how the draft unfolds, because obviously, as I mentioned, if there's a corner picked at number 5 or number 20, then that's going to create another obstacle for him to try to deal with to move up. And a really good question coming off of that from Seattle Dom, assuming Seattle doesn't go corner in round 1, can Kobe Bryant bump outside and develop into a stud opposite of Woolen? So this is the other problem that Trey Brown is dealing with, because that's where Kobe Bryant played his entire college career at Cincinnati. By the way, he won the Jim Thorpe Award playing on the outside. They better fare than even though he adjusting quite well and played better late in the season last year. I still think outside corner is probably his best spot. I just don't know on this roster if that's the best place for him to compete for playing time, even though Julian Love coming to town now may complicate things in the slot. So it's not a great situation for him either. But again, it's another player that Trey Brown might have to compete against. It's not a bad problem. It's a good problem to have when you have that many good players. But at the same time, you could also, add somebody like Devon Witherspoon or Christian Gonzalez and really make things interesting. So again, it's a good problem, but I don't know necessarily that we're going to see Kobe Bryant slide outside just because they've already got a number of bodies out there. Next question for Nick here from Bryce tweets, there's so much talk about trading up or down from number 5, but what do you think are the chances of moving up from number 20, and who would it be for? So really, I think this question is gauging who would be the prospect that you could see falling past a certain point that Seattle would be like, you know what, we're going to trade a second-round pick to move up to get in position to draft that guy.
That's a really good question. I think we are underselling the possibility of some fun stuff happening at 20 or thereabouts because we're so focused, obviously, on number 5. Man, just off the cuff, obviously, if they're one of the quarterbacks that they passed at 5 continues to fall, dare I say Will Levis falls, to the teens, do you then take a chance on Will Levis? Or does Jalen Carter have, a Laramie Tunsil situation and all of a sudden he's 13, 14, 15? I think you go get him if that happens. But I think also at 5, if he's available at 5 and the Seahawks don't take him, they might not take him at all because he's just not on their board. But at a certain point, I think it's worth the risk and going and getting a guy. So I would probably say, yeah, if Jalen Carter falls that far, I don't see that happening. But if he has a crazy draft day, scenario like that, or one of your quarterbacks that you passed on at 5 that you weren't quite sold on taking him 5th overall. But you still like his game and still can see him part of your future, whether that be a Will Levis, perhaps. I could see that. Or maybe there's a bidding war all of a sudden for Hendon Hooker. I don't know. But yeah, I do see a couple scenarios like that. Or maybe they get itchy with one of those corners if they do fall as well. But I would. It's fun to think about, but there's a few scenarios.
The problem is when you're talking about trading up from 20, that's a lot of picks and a lot of chaos that's going on in front of you that you have no idea how that's going to unfold. And so it is another one of those get on your toe type situations to make sure that you are prepared if somehow, like if Christian Gonzalez or Devon Witherspoon's there at like 12 or 13, John Schneider at that point might be trigger happy. Let's go up and get one of those guys. So it does create an interesting dynamic. And they have the draft picks behind that to be able to move up if there's an elite player that falls a little bit and they want to go get that player. Coming up next, the Seahawks free agency class is pretty much set in stone. They might add a few more pieces here after the draft, but 6 outside signings, a couple of them familiar names that have played in Seattle before. We're going to play some What's the Odds, taking a look at projections for what these players may accomplish in the 2023 season for the Seahawks. We'll get to that here in a moment. Make sure to check out for your second listen, the scouting podcast, the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast with the draft dudes from free agency to the draft, salary cap management, and more. Join NFL experts Kyle Krabs, Joe Marino, as they take you through what it's like to build a successful NFL franchise every Monday through Friday. Find Locked On NFL Scouting with the draft dudes wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, let's transition into free agency. And it's been a while since we've had a Blue Friday game day, so we needed to change that today. We're going to play What's the Odds for those that haven't seen us play this game before. We are going to have a statement about one of the free agent signings for the Seahawks, and we have to decide what the odds are that that is going to happen this season with a percentage anywhere from 0 to 100. I think we have done a negative percentage before. That's technically cheating, but we can still do that because it's our podcast and we do what we want. So without further ado, Nick, let's get to our first one here. And it's a familiar face. What are the odds Bobby Wagner eclipses 140 combined tackles for the sixth time in his career?
Well, I think he's going to get a chance to do that, just with the lack of depth the Seahawks have at linebacker. And, of course, him being he's not only returning, former defensive captain, future Ring of Honor member with the Seattle Seahawks, future Hall of Famer. The Seahawks are also down a lot of linebackers, and he's going to have to step up. And he's also coming off a very good year for the Rams. I do think he gets there, so I'm going to go 65%. I think better than 50-50. Not a certain thing with he's getting up there, with maybe some injuries or scheme with playing time, whatever it is, might chip away at that. But he's got the ability. I do think that. So I'm going to go 65, better than 50-50.
I'm going 85%. Have you seen what's in front of him right now with the depth at the defensive line? And they ranked 31st in run defense last year. I expect that they are going to have reinforcements coming in the draft and maybe adding some veterans after that. So this could change some, but I just think there's going to be enough opportunities. And this is Bobby Wagner we're talking about. There's some things that maybe he doesn't do as well as he did 4 or 5 years ago, particularly in coverage. But if there's one thing that he can still do, he can still get to the football and make tackles. And so I am very confident, even if he's got a role where he's playing 85-90% of the snaps now, I still think that he can get to 140 tackles, especially with the fact that they're probably going to have a lot of plays on defense. Hopefully not like they did a couple years ago where it felt like Bobby Wagner was on the field 80% of the game. Hopefully it's not like that, but I do think the chance is going to be there. So I'm going to say 85%. I like his odds to get there. Next one, going to the offensive side of the ball, the only offensive free agent the Seahawks added during this free agent period. What are the odds Evan Brown starts at least 12 games at center for the Seahawks in 2023?
At center might be a key phrase there. He did make 12 starts last year, and he was kind of flip-flopping between guard and center with the Lions. I really think it depends on what the Seahawks do in the draft. If they take a John Michael Schmitz or a Joe Tippmann or something like that, or I'm slipping his name from the kid from Michigan, one of those, then this, I think, goes down to 25%. But if they don't take one of the top 3 or 4 centers, interior linemen in the draft, I think it goes up to about 70%. It's really dependent on the draft. But I have a sneaking suspicion that they are going to take a center at some point. So I'm going to go 50-50. I'm going to go 50% because I'm going to cheat there a little bit because I think he does start and he makes some contributions, but it might not be at center if they do take one of those centers.
Yeah, I'm going to go 35% because I think there's a very strong possibility that Seattle drafts a center. And that's not to say he won't get some starts at guard. I could very easily see him starting more than 12 games, but playing multiple positions. This might be a situation that they're weaning a center in early in the year, and then it's time to unleash John Michael Schmitz or unleash Joe Tippmann as the starter. And then depending on how Phil Haynes plays at right guard, and if he can stay healthy, he's had injury issues. Maybe Evan Brown ends up playing right guard for you at some point. But I just have a feeling they're going to be drafting their center of the future early. The 1-year, $2.25 million contract is definitely not prohibitive for them going out and drafting a center to compete with him to start on day one. So I actually, even though I like Evan Brown a lot and I like the signing, I'm going to go below 50% just because of the center clause there. I can see him starting some games at guard, but I have a feeling they're going to have a young buck that's going to be ready to play fairly early at center for them. Next one, another player that is going to be making his return to Seattle. What are the odds Jaron Reed registers 14 or more quarterback hits in 2023.
Ooh, I like that. Yes, he definitely had his fair share of those in when he was here in Seattle. I believe he had 12 in his rookie year, and he had the 10.5 sack year. So 14 quarterback hits. That's, I think, a taller order, especially with some of the talent they've added in the interior, and especially if they bring in a certain guy named Jalen Carter. I think that would certainly maybe hinder his opportunities there. I'm gonna go 25%. Not impossible. I think it's a higher number for him. Or I guess I shouldn't say. I was looking at quarterback knockdowns. My apologies. Quarterback hits. He's got 24 that 10.5 sack year. I'll go 40%. I think that it's less than 50-50, but it's not impossible. He's shown he can do it in the past. He's been a really good pass rushing interior defensive lineman, and I think perhaps the returning to Seattle will rejuvenate him. So maybe slightly less than 50-50, but it's not impossible.
I'm going 60% because even last year, and I'll admit, I've watched a number of the Packers games, and I did not think it was one of Jaron Reed's better years, particularly defending the run. But he had 14 quarterback hits last year when he was not on top of his game. And I think getting back in Seattle with this coaching staff is going to improve his play across the board. And he's going to get opportunities, even if they add some guys in the draft. Like, he's going to have to play. If you've looked at the depth chart, they don't have very many guys with experience. He's going to get plenty of snaps. He's going to get opportunities to rush the passer. So I think 14, he's done it 2 of the past 3 years, and the other year was 12. So he's been right in that area each of the last 3 years. So I think he's got a very solid chance to be able to do that this year. Going with one of the true newcomers, a guy that hasn't played in Seattle, and maybe the most fascinating free agent addition that the Seahawks made. What's the odds? Julian Love plays at least 400 snaps with Jamal Adams and Quandre Diggs. This is a loaded one, Nick. There's a lot of variables at play here.
Yeah, so we can go, snaps with Julian Love plus Quandre Diggs without Jamal Adams, or the other way around, or both. All three of them are on the field. You can do a lot with that.
Well, that's the point here. It's all three. 400 snaps, all three of them on the field.
Well, given the fact that Julian Love played over 1,000 snaps last year, and I think we're all hopefully optimistic that Jamal Adams plays a good chunk this year. I like those chances. I do. I'm gonna go 60%. I'm gonna go optimistic. I think if Jamal Adams is healthy, I don't know, it's been a big if recently. Quandre Diggs is as stalwart as ever, and Julian Love has proven he can be a durable, reliable defensive back as well. I'm going to go 60%. Just it all really depends on the health of Jamal Adams, because I think we at this point can count on Julian Love and Quandre Diggs to show up.
I'm going to do something that I have never done on this show, and I can't believe I'm doing it because of Jamal Adams' injury history. I'm going to say 100%. I just listening to Pete Carroll, and that's putting an incredible amount of faith in Jamal Adams to stay healthy, but I think he is going to be incredibly motivated coming in this year with what has happened in the last 2 years. A lot of people talking about, hey, the Seahawks should cut him. He's not worth anywhere close to the money that he's worth or getting paid. So I think he's going to come in with a boulder on his shoulder, and that might not change anything with the injury luck, but I just have a feeling that he is going to come in motivated, ready to prove people I am still an elite safety. Quandre Diggs has been pretty healthy aside from the injury he had a couple years ago, but that was the end of the season. He came back and he played in every game last year, and Julian Love's been durable. So I think 400 is a pretty low total. I have high expectations. They're going to be playing 550, 600 snaps plus together, because I think that's going to be the base package for the Seahawks defense this year, is those 3 safety looks. So I might get burned by this, because Jamal Adams' injury history, but I'm actually going 100%. I think 400 snaps, I think you lock it in right now. Those 3 guys are going to be playing a lot of snaps together. Next one here, another newcomer. Devin Bush plays a higher snap percentage, 78% or more, than Cody Barton did in 2022.
Well, he played 62% of the defensive snaps last year. He's actually gotten above that in his first 3 seasons. And I'm going to go 35%. I'm a little worried about some of the stuff I've seen on film. You've done some great breakdowns on Devin Bush and some of the Bobby Wagner coming in. And I do believe they're probably going to draft a linebacker. as well, and maybe put him in there and compete with snaps with Devin Bush. I'm a little worried about the boomer bust with Devin Bush, and having playing less than that would mean that he's kind of busting out with the Seahawks too. I understand, but it might come out of necessity, I guess. I could see it that that's why I'm not saying 0%, but with a lack of depth. But I'm gonna go 35%. Not impossible, maybe less than 50-50, but I think out of sheer necessity, it's certainly possible.
I'm going 10%. I think that it's not impossible, but I would be very surprised if he plays that much. And there's a couple other variables that you did not mention. We don't know when Jordan Brooks is going to be back. Now, if you read between the tea leaves, some of the comments John Schneider has made recently comparing it to John Radigan, that would tell you he's probably going to miss at least the first half of the season, is what the Seahawks are thinking. But at some point, Jordan Brooks is going to be back, and he is going to play when he is healthy. And Bobby Wagner is back and still playing at a high level. I can't see Devin Bush playing over either one of those guys when they are healthy. And then you add in the fact we just talked about all the three safety looks, like who comes off the field when they're playing 5-6 defensive back formations. The second linebacker is going to be checking out of the game. And I can't see, maybe Bobby Wagner ends up being that guy because he's getting to be an older player and there are some limitations in coverage, but Bush hasn't exactly been great in coverage the last couple of years. So he's going to have a lot to prove on that front, and they might end up drafting a linebacker. There's a lot of, I just seeing that he have that big of a role on this defense on a one-year deal. And maybe he'll prove me wrong. If he does, great, but I'm going to go 10%. And last but not least, the big fish for the Seahawks in free agency. What are the odds Draymond Jones surpasses the career high with 7 or more sacks in 2023?
Well, I love the idea, and it certainly would be a boost. I always feel like it's one of those signings where we're really excited, and I think he's going to do some great things in Seattle, but sometimes the numbers don't quite add up to the expectations and the excitement and the hype. I do think he gets his. I do think he gets some sacks and is very productive for the Seahawks. I'm very optimistic. I'm not sure he quite gets to 7. He's done 6.5, I believe, 2 of the last 3 years.
Yeah,
I think he gets 5, 6, 7 plus from the interior. 5 tech, 3 tech. That might be a tall task right now, but I do think he's going to be a very solid player, but maybe not necessarily a 7 plus sack defensive lineman. So I'll go. I know I've been kind of hovering around 50-50. I'm going to go 40% here. I think it's certainly possible. Hope I'm wrong because I have pretty high hopes for him. But just sometimes that doesn't quite materialize in the way people think, but he could still be a very, very solid player for this team.
Yeah, I'm going to go right at 50% on this one because I could see him getting 7 or 8 sacks. I could see him getting 3 or 4, but still being very effective getting after the quarterback. What really matters to me with interior rushers is pressure percentage and quarterback hits. Those are the numbers that I really look at. And again, he's been consistent, at least 5 sacks each of the past 3 years, twice 6.5. So he's been right on the cusp of this. So I think it would be underselling his ability going lower than 50%, but at the same time, it is hard to get sacks from the interior, and Seattle's got some really explosive guys on the outside that I think are going to have a chance to get a lot of sacks that are created by pressure from Jones, and so that may take away from some of his potential sack production. So I'm going to go right at 50-50 chance for him to be able to do that. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Nick at NickLee51. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and all major podcast platforms to ensure that you don't miss a single episode. Coming up on Monday, it'll be Mock Draft Monday. We're getting close to the end of our Mock Draft Monday series because the actual draft is coming soon. We're going to be diving into some expert mock drafts and taking a look at this year's guard class in our 3 tiers, day 1, day 2, and day 3 prospects that could be on the board for the Seattle Seahawks. We hope you'll be joining us. Enjoy your weekend. Go Hawks.